Coming up on Booked on Rock, the untold stories behind the rise of bands like Blues Traveler, Phish, Spin Doctors, the Dave Matthews Band. We're talking the 90s jam band explosion next.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Everybody, welcome back to Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. This episode's guest is Mike Ayers. He's the author of Sharing the Groove, the untold story of the 90s jam band explosion and the scene that followed. Thanks for being here, Mike.
Thanks, Eric.
I was telling you just before we started recording, buying tickets to see Blues Traveler, Gin Blossoms, and Spin Doctors, so good timing.
Yeah, the 90s is alive and well.
As a huge fan of these bands, I'm really interested in your background. You actually had a firsthand experience working with Phish in the 90s?
I did. It was a wild story. A very good friend of mine, we were huge fans starting in, I don't know, we saw our first shows in 94 and 95 came around. We were itching to see, we'd seen a bunch of shows in summer 95 and we were itching to see a show in fall 95. And we cooked up this plan to go from Blacksburg, Virginia to the Palace in Auburn Hills, Michigan. They were playing there a Saturday night, 10/28/95. I got some tickets and we were all set to go. And then I was looking at their itinerary and I was like, they're in Kalamazoo, Michigan the night before. It would be insane if we went all the way to Michigan and only saw one show when they were playing two. And I was like, so what do you think? Should we go to Friday night as well? It's sold out. We don't have tickets. It's a minor league hockey arena. Like it could be a little tricky. She was like, yes, we should definitely do that. I was like, great. So we left on Thursday night and drove all night. We got to the parking lot at around 11 the next morning in Kalamazoo. We weaseled our way in through the security guard to the actual parking lot. I went across the street to go to the bathroom at a bowling alley. When I came out, she was talking to what was, to me, a random woman. It was someone who worked for Phish. She was asking if we had tickets. We said no. And she was perplexed that we would drive all the way from Virginia to a show without tickets. And we were like, well, we're very confident that we'll get in. And she was like, well, one of the things that we've been doing is we've been offering kids that don't have tickets, if they want to prep cook for the band for the day in exchange for tickets and passes, you can do that. And we were like, yes, we will do that. And she wheeled us backstage. Within like 5 minutes, we're backstage meeting their chefs. They traveled at that point with part of their crew was professional cooks. And they got us to work immediately, scrubbing potatoes, washing dishes, like doing all the work you do when you're 19 years old and a band that you love tells you what to do. We did it. And it just kind of blossomed from there. They liked us, they connected with us, the cooks. And so Phish had them with them for a long time. And so any show that we wanted to go to from there, we could just get in touch with the chefs.
There's the sweet spot right there.
There's the sweet spot. Like that night we were having dinner and we were, we've been on our feet all day. We were pretty exhausted. And the head chef, I'll never forget, she just is sitting at the table with us, kind of making conversation. And it's just like, so are you guys going to Chicago? And that was like in 4 days. And that was the Halloween show. They played Quadrophenia. And we were like, no, we're not going to Chicago. Of course, we would love to, but it's been sold out for months. And she just like deadpan looks us in the eye and says, well, why don't you just come and cook? And we said, yes, we will come to Chicago. We will cook. We will blow off classes. We're in. And we did. And it just kind of went from there. They stopped getting kids from the tour lot that tour, fall 95. But I guess we connected with them. We weren't crazy around the band. We just kept to ourselves. We did our work. We loved the music. We saw the shows. We drove to the next one. We were 19-year-old kids, but I like to think we kept it pretty professional and we had a sweet deal. We didn't want to jeopardize anything. We were pinching ourselves. We were backstage with our favorite band at some of the biggest shows New Year's 95, New Year's 97, Quadrophenia, Island Tour, like all sorts of things that became seminal in Phish history. They were on fire. They were on fire.
I was just telling my chiropractor yesterday. I have my I have my appointment, and he knows I have this podcast. He says, "Read any good books lately?" I said, "Funny you should ask. I read a really awesome book on the '90s jam band explosion." And he said, "What's a jam band?" I was like, "Whoa, wait a minute. I got to remind myself that some people may not be aware of this." I said, "Well, it's bands basically who maybe take a 3-4 minute song they record in the studio and extend it and just kind of improvise, and they change up the set list. I mean, that's the best way I could describe it." I said it's kind of like a jazz band type of thing. How would you best describe a jam band?
I've been asked the same question. It's really rock bands or jazz bands or funk bands that have an improv ethos. Okay, so they believe in improv, they believe in live music, they believe in marrying those things together. And I think as the book explains in certain ways, they hold that to such a high standard in their life, in their creation of art, that labels, at the time radio, at the time record stores, sure, we'll interact with them, but at the end of the day, the community and the people that are watching us play and experiencing us, they matter the most. They're going to matter the most. Now, not every band had that experience throughout the 90s, but they certainly started out that way. And there's a lot of bands that have carried on that ethos today, which is really great to see. And the bands from that era as well are still going on, and they believe that. It's not to say they don't love the studio. Of course, they love making a great studio record, and some of the records that they made back then are phenomenal. But a jam band for me is just, one that believes in their audience and live music and making sure that they're delivering that in as a powerful way as possible they can every night. And they believe that. And wherever that takes them, that's cool.
And you talk to so many people for the book. It's really not who you talk to, it's who didn't you talk to. You talk to guys in Blues Traveler, God Street Wine, Spin Doctors. They all take us back to the origins of the scene. And the first quote from the first chapter is from David Graham, the manager of Blues Traveler, who says, quote, "Princeton is the forgotten center of rock and roll." So let's start there. Take us back to Princeton, New Jersey, the origins of the 90s jam band scene. This would be back to mid 80s?
Yeah, like the early 80s.
Early.
Yeah, to me, it was just really interesting that you had Lo and Tomo from God Street, you had Trey from Phish, Tom Marshall, who's written with Trey, Chris from Spin Doctors, the Blues Traveler guys, they all lived there. They all knew who each other was. They all interacted in certain ways, some more than others, but they developed in Princeton, and from there went off to New York, went off to Burlington, and started to develop their craft as bands. But to me, that's really where they got their start. And at the same time, you had Widespread Panic in Athens doing the same thing. Phish up in Burlington was getting together. You even had Sprinklings out in Boulder. So things were happening that were from kids that grew up on radio, but they believed in live performance. They'd seen the Dead, they'd seen Zappa, they'd seen jazz musicians, and they melded that into a philosophy, I think, that live is where we're at. When Blues Traveler moved to New York and those guys were living there and they were just getting started, they were playing out like 6, 7 nights a week. And they would take any gig that would have them. And a lot of the clubs back then were not looking for cover bands. They were looking for people who could write original music. So they were hell bent on doing that. And I think some of the guys said to me, when you're playing out 6 or 7 nights a week, you're going to get good. It might not be tomorrow, but if you keep doing it, and if your nose to the grind is so much that you as a group are going to do this, you could potentially get pretty good. And they did.
And sometimes playing till 5, 6 in the morning.
5, 6 in the morning. Like a fascinating thing is, Spin Doctors and Blues Traveler sharing bills often in those early days. And They would change sets, but they wouldn't stop. So Blues Traveler would start to slowly come on to the stage and pick up an instrument that one person from Spin Doctors put down. And so over a course of several minutes or 10 minutes or so, you would essentially have Blues Traveler taking over for Spin Doctors or vice versa without ever stopping playing. It sounds like it could be a mess, but I don't think it was. And imagine witnessing something like that. That's a determination to just let things take it where it needs to take.
That's the essence of the jam band vibe, is that it could go horribly wrong or it could go really well. And when they click, there's something magical that happens.
For sure. And that's what gets people, I think, coming back because you still, to this day, it's one of these places in the world where we are, where you can go and that's what you're going to see, the unexpected, right? There's a lot of shows that a lot of live music where obviously they have a set list, they play the set list every night, maybe one deviation here or there, but for the most part, it's going to be the same. And that's cool. But in this world, the unexpected and the novelty of doing something new, it's rewarding for them. And they know that their audience loves it too. And it's very rare. So when you find people that are into that, they feed off of each other.
It's a risk to do what these jam bands are doing, but over time you develop that audience. And Grateful Dead, by allowing the tape sharing, that was a huge thing.
Oh yeah, tape sharing was monumental. And yeah, certainly they started it, and all the acts in this book were completely not only okay with it, they at sometimes used it to grow their fan base by seeding it. They would send it out to clubs to get gigs, like live tapes, right? They would send them out to fans that they knew who would then organically spread it because they believed in it. They knew that this was a method that could work for them, so they tried, and it did. It was very instrumental in getting their fan bases built up. When you have bands that have never been to Colorado and they go to Colorado and everybody in the crowd is singing along and they don't have a commercial release, something has happened. Multiple acts told me that this was a thing that was happening and they instantly saw the value of it. And record labels were trying to shut them down. And of course, they weren't into it. And they were adamant about that never happening.
But what a way to promote. Check this out. Give it a listen, man. You have to see these guys live. That's free promotion.
Yeah, exactly. Mark from the Disco Biscuits, he was talking about how in tape trading, if the band puts it out, like if the band was like, buy my tape, buy my tape, buy my tape, it's marketing. But if random fan says, you got to listen to this band, the Disco Biscuits, here's a tape, it's word of mouth that cannot be beat. And that's what it was. It was word of mouth through a rudimentary internet network that people were just really passionate about. I mean, I can't tell you the amount of tapes that I dubbed for people that I'd never met that I would just post on various message boards. Like I just got in X tape, I can spin it for 10 people if you send me blanks, if you send me postage. And they did. And I did that for years and years and years, mainly because I thought that what I had needed to get out there. And this was a super easy way to do that. It wasn't hard.
Archive.org is the one that has a lot of dead stuff.
Archive.org, it continues to have tons of stuff from that era, from all the bands in this book. I certainly ransacked it during the writing and research for this book because they have so much. John from the Disco Biscuits told me about a seminal show in their history on Halloween '97. Okay, great. Archive.org has that. I could listen to it right after we talked. Phenomenal.
I love the early John Popper story, the early pre-famous John Popper stories. Him and Chris Barron from the Spin Doctors were friends going back to their school days. but there's another school friend who has a story that's in the book that I love. One is from David, I think it's pronounced, is it Prashore? Blues Traveler Tour Manager. Yeah. His first day, he's a junior at Princeton High School, the school assembly. He never heard John play before, and he comes walking out on stage.
The dude was super high, and he was like, "What is this guy coming out with a lunchbox full of harmonicas? This is going to be,
There's like a tie-dye colored lunchbox, and he comes
yeah,
lumbering up on
this is going to be
stage.
horrendous." And Popper, a young Popper, high school Popper, just floored him, blew him away, and motivated him immediately to go up to him and said, "We need to do this. There's something here, and we need to dig deep to figure out what that is." Eventually, the guys from Blues Traveler, they all coalesced together, and there it was. But yeah, Dave was with them from the beginning and was helping them from day one in the early days in New York. He moved with them and was helping them with bookings. And I was talking about that, playing out 6, 7 nights a week. Like, he was there, and he was very, I would say, business minded at the beginning to make sure they had a steady stream of gigs and were getting things done. And they did.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Hold on.
Talk about the hot spots at that time for shows. There's a Spin Doctor song called Larrabee's Gang, and I love the lyric. Stoop so fine on a summer's eve when you sit outside for a short reprieve. Talk to folks as they come and leave. John O.J. and Crazy Steve. One of my favorite Spin songs. That's referring to Nightingales, right?
Yeah, referring to Nightingales, I'm guessing, I don't know for sure. Crazy Steve might be Steve Eichner, who's the photographer in the book. Jono is Jono Manson, who's also in the book. He's a little bit of an older figure than the folks that were in the book. Like, he was kind of a little bit of a mentor. He'd been in New York for a while. He'd been in bands and helped show people the ropes, but he was certainly a part of the scene. But yeah, I mean, there was, very dirty clubs at the beginning that were really wanting to sell beer all night and have people play originals. And Blues Traveler was willing to play Nightingales on like a Monday night, which was typically a dead night. And so they could get a gig at what is typically a dead night, but it pretty quickly became not a dead night because they were crushing it. They were blowing the roof off. So people kept coming back. They tapped into that ethos that you were talking about, where you don't necessarily repeat the set list. You don't necessarily want to play the same thing over and over. You want to keep people on their toes. You want to excite them through the music that you're playing them. And I think they knew that. So they were very cognizant about making the experience something that people wanted to continue experiencing.
There's a song called Nightingale,
By God Street,
God Street Wine. I know it's about a person, but is that a reference to Nightingales?
I didn't ask them specifically about that. I'm sure they've been asked about that a bunch. I would assume that it is a sly reference to a club that gave them their first gig for sure, and was certainly a home base early on for them with Blues Traveler and Spin Doctors.
Buy a beer, find a place to stand, have a couple laughs and hear the band, smoke a couple of your favorite brand, wake up with a stamp on the back of your hand. Yeah, man, that's cool. Chris Barron, I'm a big fan. Even his solo work he's an outstanding songwriter. I recommend people check out his solo work, especially nowadays. You can access it easily now, Spotify, all the places. But he had a solo acoustic album. In fact, I went to see Spins one time, and after the show, I brought his acoustic solo CD and asked him to sign it. He was like, "Whoa!" Like, he couldn't believe it. Wow, somebody, because it was hard to find. You had to get it like CD Baby.
That's cool. All the musicians in this book have continued to pursue art and a creative life. Spin Doctors obviously got very huge off of 2 songs, and that changed their trajectory from the scene for sure. They were on MTV nonstop, and they went from the Horde tour to the MTV's Alternative Nation tour with Screaming Trees and Soul Asylum in about a year. So they had a very different experience, but at the end of the day, they love music. They love that they impacted so many people with 2 songs, but they continue to like creating a lot.
But Little Miss Can't Be Wrong and Two Princes, yeah, like you say, two big hits. And Chris Barron talks about when he's asked, do you get sick of playing the hits? He's like, well, let me see. I'm playing songs that get people on their feet, cheering and smiling. No, I'm pretty good with playing those songs every night. And Little Miss Can't Be Wrong, I love because that's a revenge song. That's about his stepmother. And he talked about her to you for the book. Nasty woman, man. His brother kept a machete under the bed.
Yeah, no, it didn't seem like a good vibe by any means. I also like too how he was talking about there was this kind of hippie vibe around the Spin Doctors or whatever, but at the same time, grunge was breaking, right? And that was kind of like held up as a genre or a music form at the moment that was super dark and super heavy. And I'm not saying it wasn't, but he was very emphatic of that. A lot of spin stuff could be dark as well. It certainly had a pop tinge to it, or, it was played in the gap or whatever, but that doesn't mean that it didn't have dark elements to it. All these acts certainly flirted, if not straight up, wrote some pretty dark things at times, or very personal things. The Phish album, Billy Breathes, is an album that I was referencing a few moments ago about, making a really great studio record. And I still to this day think it's a really great record, but there's just some really personal moments on it that I don't think we had seen from the band at that point. And, specifically the song Billy Breathes about Trey's daughter, about him experiencing his newborn, just really incredible, gorgeous stuff. And it might get lost in the chalk dust torture of the worlds, the mango songs of the world, the you enjoy myself of the Phish world. That was this, more fantasy type stuff that they also were doing, but they were doing a lot of really personal stuff too as the decade went on, and just I think wanted to push themselves forward.
That was the frustration, though, with these bands like Chris Barron's story about Epic Records being more into Pearl Jam than the Spin Doctors in the beginning. But there were two things that happened. There was a letter from a program director at a radio station in New Hampshire or Vermont.
EQX in Vermont.
Vermont. But the other one was a tequila shot contest.
Yeah, the story goes that the label was sitting on the record. This program director, Jim McGuinn, wrote an emphatic letter like, you are sleeping on this. It got to the label, but also that there was, I guess, a team building event or the team going out, and one of the people lower on the marketing team said, if I can drink you under the table, if I can do more tequila shots to you, vice president of marketing or whatever, we will promote the Spin Doctors record, Pocket Full of Kryptonite. And she did it. She crushed some tequila, and those two things kind of, I think, came together and made it so they started putting a little oomph behind it, and it worked.
It sure did.
Yeah,
Sure
and
did.
they started seeing traction at top 40 radio, which was something that they were not expecting at all. Like rock radio, sure, but top 40, not at all. And then MTV's calling for videos, and it kind of snowballed from there. But it's not to say that Pocket Full of Kryptonite came out and then a month later the Spin Doctors were everywhere. They weren't. Like, I don't know what is in people's minds, but it came out, a bunch of other records came out, and the Spin Doctors were largely ignored for 9 months. They didn't break. It wasn't like this huge marketing scheme that made these massive hits, and they were just a part of this machine. They weren't. They quietly did their record, and they liked it. And then they were touring on it, and the label wasn't doing anything on it.
Yeah, they were ready to wind it up, or wind it down, I should say, and get ready to start recording another album. Aaron Comas talks about that. And they were like, no, man, we still believe in this album, and we're touring, and these people are really responding well to this. I think we need to keep going with this. We got to give it another shot.
Yeah, and that goes back to the ethos around playing live. They were seeing people respond to the music The label was not. And you just don't hear many stories of a label putting things out and not wanting to support it. But there are those instances back then where it was just like, we're seeing what sticks to the wall, we're seeing what money we have today, and we'll give it our best shot. And if these couple artists don't fit into that plan, well, they made a record and okay, that's it. Spin Doctors could have gone down that path. They could have, like the label could have said, you know what, we didn't put any money behind it and we're not going to, and deliver your next thing and we're gone.
Were most jam bands at odds with record labels?
I think they were at odds in that they knew their audience and the labels were always trying to get an audience that was not their audience, right? They're trying to get on the radio, right? They're trying to have these mass appeals, and they had these ways to do it. And some artists went with it in some ways, some didn't. A lot were emphatic that we're not going to do it. I remember the story that Dave Schools was telling me about Capricorn asking him to play the song that they're pushing at radio every night, right? So they could connect, and fans who heard that on the radio could connect that to a live show. And they were like, why would we do that? That sounds so boring. That sounds boring for us. We wouldn't no, we're not doing that. And they had to stick to their guns with that sort of mentality. But at the end of the day, Widespread Panic, 6, 7 years after that story that I'm telling, has 100,000 people show up in Athens, Georgia for a free concert in 98. And who else is doing that at that time? No one.
Grateful Dead went through that, though, with Oxo Moxoa when they were recording that album, and the label said, what are we going to do with this? And they basically said, do whatever you want with it. If you want to let us go, but we're not changing.
Right. Yeah. It's a hard thing. It's a hard thing I think, for anybody to really stand up to what you believe in when you're also very cognizant about there's things at stake, right? And you don't know how things are going to shake out. You don't know if that next gig is going to be sold out. You just have to kind of believe that it will be, and that believe that what you're doing is great and people are responding to that. But then it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the word of mouth around tapes. And like, so that, they were cognizant too that word of mouth was powerful and that people were sharing things, and it didn't necessarily matter so much if they had radio exposure or Tower Records moving tons of CDs. Now, it's not to say that some bands didn't connect with those means and have massive exposure, Spin Doctors, Blues Traveler for sure, but they had been doing it for a long time at that point. None of this was an overnight sensation. It was extreme work ethic. Whether you like the bands or not, I remember conversations I would have with people in the 90s that were, into more indie rock or punk rock or whatever, and they didn't like jam bands. But they never knocked the work ethic. They knew what they were doing and could tell that the amount of spirit that they were putting into this and just work was incredible.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
The time has come for someone to put his foot down, and that foot is me.
I want to ask you about a quote in the book. It's actually the title of a chapter 3. For $40,000, we could make a record, and you could spend the money on hamburgers, guns, pot, a van. Where's that quote come from? Who's that quote come from?
That comes from the A&R at Blues Travelers label, A&M. Patrick Clifford, great dude. He was the one that essentially brought Blues Traveler to A&M, and he's negotiating with essentially Bill Graham. David Graham was Bill Graham's son, and Bill Graham is obviously the huge concert promoter from the 60s that, did The Dead and Jefferson Airplane and Fillmore and Almonds and everything. And so he's essentially negotiating the deal with Bill and David to get them to essentially to make a record. And he's just being like, you can spend the money on whatever. This is the money. Just you need to make a record. We're not going to be keeping tabs on every little thing you spend money on. Go do what you do that I saw, and let's do this. The interesting thing is that they had several records before four broke.
I was just about to say that that first album, the self-titled debut, but anyway, was being played on the local rock station here in New Haven, Connecticut, back in 91,
Yeah.
92 maybe.
Yeah.
And then it became a hit after Runaround. But yeah, three albums, the debut, Travelers and Thieves, and Save a Soul.
Save a Soul. And then four came around, and I think great songs on it, but also a lot of times with these things, stars have to align, and they did at that time. And Hook caught the public's consciousness.
Runaround and Hook. Those are the two
Yeah,
big
Run
ones.
Around caught the public's consciousness and it took off from there. But like I was saying, like they had been doing it for a long time. They had been opening up for the Allman Brothers and Jerry Garcia band for years. Like they were opening for, I think, Leonard Skinner out in Europe. They were doing everything possible to get their live show in front of more people, but also continue with the core fans and just kind of build it up those ways through these live means.
Was David Letterman a fan by that time, by the early 90s, or did he come along after? Because he gave them exposure. He was a huge fan.
I think he was pretty hip to these guys like early on. I mean, remember, like he was on late night. He was on like the 12:30 slot, right? So he wasn't on 11:30. So you had a lot more freedom with what you were putting on. So I don't know off the top of my head when they played Letterman, but he certainly was. Him and Conan in the 90s were really hip to these alternative bands. And if you throw jammy acts into that, it certainly fit the bill. Yeah, he was definitely a fan of Phish in the 90s. He had this time slot that he cultivated a rather weird personality, and so he could get away with that. But I don't think he really waned when he moved to 11:30 either. He still stuck by his vibe that he had created at that later time slot.
We're talking with Mike Ayers, is the author of Sharing the Groove, the untold story of the 90s jam band explosion and the scene that followed. I would be remiss not mentioning Bobby Sheehan, the late bassist of Blues Traveler. He sadly died of an overdose in August of 1999. Much loved, not just by his bandmates, but that whole scene. There seemed to be a lot of respect for him. He was like the guy, like the elder statesman in a way.
He was like a tried and true deadhead, but the way that people described him to me was very much like a glue. He kept things together in ways that when people can keep things together, it's just like an indescribable thing. And he was that and wickedly talented as well. Everybody spoke about that glueness, that stickiness, and how talented he was. So, yeah, I think it was like a moment in not only that band's history, but the culture's history, the scene's history of him passing. Obviously, there was some demons that he was working out, and it certainly changed things. Brendan Hill says some really amazing things at the end of the book about that moment, about the end of the 90s that I just adore. It just really puts in perspective how intense that decade was for the musicians creating this music.
Brendan, the drummer of Blues Traveler, great drummer. The jam band scene had already had that impact of having to experience the passing of Jerry Garcia. That was August of 95. That was a major musical turning point in the mid-90s. Talk about that for the young bands and the jam band culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of people that would say the narrative is that the dead died and that's why Phish became big. I don't think that's the case. Phish was already on a trajectory that was selling out Madison Square Garden, like filling amphitheaters, whether the Dead were playing or not. I was there. I was there in summer 95 seeing both bands. Just as amount of people at the Dead were filling up Phish shows, right? Like I was seeing them in amphitheaters around the East Coast. And it's not like it was deadheads that were there that were just bored with the Dead. It was people that were fanatical about Phish. It was happening. Like there was a movement happening. When Jerry passed, there was a lot of problems with the Dead tour that summer. There was this inclination that there was a lot of seedy elements in their parking lot, and it just wasn't really going well. And then that seedy element moved over to the Fish lot because they needed somewhere to go. Look, I don't know exactly if that happened, but I do think that that did happen. Tickets did start to get harder to get. But, Phish played a festival the year after, 96, their own festival, the Clifford Ball in upstate New York, in Plattsburgh, New York, and 70,000 people showed up. They played a festival in the 90s in Florida, Big Cypress. Tons of people showed up, more than 70,000 people showed up. Massive. That was going to happen whether the Dead were playing or not. They were on this route where people were connecting to them in their live show and their lore, the lore that they had created, so much so. It was 100% different.
Booked on Rock podcast. We'll be back after this.
Well, sir, can I go now? Go on. All right, you sit down. I'll be right back.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, plus a video highlight and a link to our YouTube channel. Links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. The Phish story is fascinating that it goes all the way back to 84. This band had been around.
They've been around,
a long time. What was the thing that Trey Anastasio said about the drinking age in 1983 being crucial to their story?
Yeah, I mean, it was like the only place in the country that still had a drinking age of 18. Okay, so anybody that went to college at University of Vermont could go to a bar and see a band and have a drink. So therefore, he said that the opportunity for bands to exist was tenfold from your normal place because you had all of these bars wanting to bring in 18 or 19-year-olds, and they needed something for them to do. Watching a band, listening to a band play was something that they could do. So they had this opportunity to play and play and play and play and play, and people would come and watch them and essentially get connected to them. They loved them from the start. I don't know if you could say if 21 was the age, things would be different. They're incredibly talented. They would have found a way to play, and people would have found a way to see them. But in those early days, certainly just having a space to play, a club owner or a bar owner being like, yes, we will pay you a little money if you come play. It was a huge thing. It was a huge thing for a young act, just cutting their teeth and just wanting to be out. That's the thing. Like all of these acts, they just wanted to be out and be better than they were the night before. And they just worked at it. So yeah, that's Burlington. It had these spaces that wanted bands. And so there was a lot of different types of bands up there that were playing. So whatever music style you liked, you could go and see. Originals, covers, all the stuff.
Similar with Dave Matthews Band, their story starts in Charlottesville, Virginia. You said that they did something revolutionary right out of the gate musically. Talk about that and their rise to prominence.
They essentially they came together organically in Charlottesville, which was not necessarily known as a music mecca, just really started playing out around town. But also, like Widespread Panic, like a lot of these acts got on the road pretty quickly. They're interesting because they had a saxophone, they had a violin. Dave's voice is not your typical voice on radio at the time. It was different. The way he would sing, the way he would phrase notes was unique. And we've been talking about how this scene values uniqueness. I was at school in Virginia, at Virginia Tech in 1994, and his Remember Two Things had just come out. The record stores there could not stock that. That was a word of mouth record.
That was the pre-major label. That was pre.
Pre-major label. It had the 3D art thing on the front that was super popular back then. That was the record cover, so it was super distinct in that realm. And most of the tracks on it were live, if I'm remembering correctly, or it could be the flip side. Regardless, it was a mix of studio and live tracks, which was also just different. And everybody could not stop talking about Dave Matthews at Virginia Tech in 1994, but mainly because he was essentially a hometown hero. He had played fraternities at Virginia Tech in the early 90s. He was just very adamant about going around the state to cities and just bringing their thing.
Ants Marching, Tripping Billies, Satellites on there. Those are the ones that ended up on Under the Table and Dreaming.
Yeah, so he embodied the same path and live ethos that everyone else did and would open for these acts in places that he had never been before. Again, it's just crazy hustle. Not playing live, it's not like they're sitting around. It's constant practice.
You mentioned Widespread Panic. Let's talk about their origin story, because here's another interesting one. They come from an area where REM was big, the B-52s.
Yeah, Panic came from a very artsy alternative Athens. They were listening to that, but also classic rock. And again, kind of like the Nightingales in New York, they got some early gigs at some early clubs that didn't have people playing on Monday nights, and they were raising their hand and saying, we will play, but they didn't fit the artsy mold. Dave Schools said we were the alternative to the alternatives, which is a great line about where they essentially fit in terms of Athens. They were jammy, but they didn't really listen to the Dead. Mike Hauser, I don't believe, knew about the Dead really until he got into the band. And they just had a love of, I think, classic rock, Southern rock, and wanted to play out. And they found places that wanted live music. One of the things that I thought was very interesting about the conversations I had was all these acts were pretty smart early on in tapping fraternities. Fraternities wanted live music to play their parties. They also had very big budgets. So they would get really big paychecks that would not necessarily be a paycheck like they would see at a club on a Monday night where they would split the door or get 10% of beer sales or whatever they worked out. But frats would have parties and essentially hire them, and they would work that. All these acts would work that.
REM did the same thing.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, they were a huge college band.
But, like Widespread Panic is not like Widespread Panic was going to be played on college radio. REM certainly was.
Yeah, Widespread Panic never had a hit single, too. That's a lot of these bands that didn't have a hit single developed a huge following despite that.
Widespread Panic, a little trivia here, had a mini hit single called Hope in a Hopeless World in Germany.
Wow.
Yes, around like 98. So when they did a tour over there, I think they were encouraged to play Hope in a Hopeless World more often than not. So I have not looked at the set list recently, but if for some reason someone was to say, you know what, they played that a little more than usual over there, I would be like, this might be why.
That's funny. Well, the Horde Festival, that was a big deal in terms of these bands playing live. Huge in the 90s. Horizons of rock developing everywhere. Goes all the way back to 92. Now, this was a way to avoid playing clubs and get outdoors. This was John Popper's idea?
Yeah, it was a Popper and his manager, Dave Fry. They wanted to go out in the summer. They were seeing, like Bill Graham did Lollapalooza. They were seeing what was happening with Lollapalooza and thought that they could replicate that if they combined several bands from the scene that had 2 or 3,000 per market, showing up to their shows, maybe 500 showing up to their shows. And if they combine them, they could maybe fill up 10, 12,000, 13,000. It's great logic, and it worked. They only played 8 shows that first Horde tour. It wasn't huge, but it was seminal in that it put them on the map for promoters to say, oh, 10,000 people are showing up at this amphitheater to watch bands that aren't on the radio, and maybe there's some tie-dyes and hacky sacks in the parking lot. Okay, this might be interesting. It was seminal, I think, in that way that not only did it do that, but it gave everybody experience playing in a larger place to make that next step. Like, can we make this next step? Will our sounds, will our vibe translate to 10,000 who we aren't seeing right up in front of us? You know, there is distance, there's a lawn. Is it going to translate?
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
Come out wherever you are.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. What about those bands that didn't have the huge single? They deserve a lot of attention. God Street Wine we talked about, Disco Biscuits you mentioned, Mo is another great one, Government Mule, Strange Folk, String Cheese Incident. Is there a band that stands out for you of the lesser known mainstream bands from that era?
They're all fantastic, I think. I remember back then, though, thinking that when I heard Mo's No Doy album, their first major label album, I thought they were going to get huge.
Really?
I did, yeah. It was a great record. I thought that if the people that liked jammy music, but also liked Primus, liked a lot of different music and could get past any preconceived notions of what their audience may be, that they would like it. It didn't hit like I thought it would, but I still love that record. I thought it was going to be massive. You know, String Cheese deliberately didn't sign a record deal. They had a lot of opportunities and turned it down and went independent. They, I think, knew that they never were going to do crazy record sales that a record label wants. And I think they'd seen Mo. I think they'd seen what happened with Sony and Mo and knew that that could very well happen to them. So why don't we just retain control? You see a lot of artists these days talk about the control that they have retained. And back then, with a band like String Cheese Incident, that was super weird and risky to be like, no, we're just going to do it on our own. We're going to do ticketing on our own. Who are you? Oh, you know, we're filling up 1,000-person theaters, 2,000-person theaters. We'll just keep it to ourselves. That's fine. If we grow bigger, great. If we don't, this is pretty good. But at least we have control of our destiny. That sounds super cheesy, but that's what it is.
Mo was with Sony in the 90s for a 3-album deal. Was it Fat Boy Records their own label?
Yeah, Fat Boy's their own label.
That was before and after Sony. They went back to releasing them under the Fat Boy label.
And they didn't need to. They had seen how their independent CDs were selling in CD stores when their major label record was right next to it. So not only did they have all the contacts for that distribution from that time, they also had the data that showed, oh, our indie releases are doing pretty well with like no marketing. People know who we are and they're buying these things. So yeah, you know, I didn't get into it with them on whether or not they wanted to pursue another label after Sony. My guess is they didn't, but it's been fine. I mean, like in 2006, they were playing 2 nights at Radio City Music Hall.
They're still out there, huge following. That's really the bottom line with these bands, whether or not they were going to have hate or not. The Spin Doctor story is just crazy, though, to me, because that second album, Turn It Upside Down, I love that album. And they did have a song that almost made the top 40, You Let Your Heart Go Too Fast. Then things just fell apart. You know, the guitarist was out, and it just things never really got back on track for them. And they've made many albums since then, and some of them are really, really good. I don't understand why things went south so quickly. The story is that they led with Cleopatra's Cat as the lead single on that second album, and that's the reason that maybe they should have gone with You Let Your Heart Go Too Fast as the first one. I don't know. Times were changing anyway, so that's the fickle business.
I think there was tension at the label in terms of what the label wanted, their expectations. It's wild that they thought, in today's terms, it's wild to think that a record that sells 2 million albums is a bomb.
I'm glad you mentioned that because we have to keep that in mind. It wasn't because the first one sold like 15 million or whatever the hell it
Yeah,
was.
I mean it was astronomical, but like that's the second one still did pretty well. And to me, it just kind of shows that it was such a, oh, what did you do for me today?
Right.
Oh, you didn't sell 10 million? Okay, but you only sold 2 million. Yeah, I guess we have to keep going, but maybe you're over. And versus like nurturing and continuing to work with an artist. I don't personally know if that is what happened, but that would be my guess that the labels were very much into moving on to the flavor of the moment versus the artists cultivating fan bases. And now you see it all the time where like you hear about artists and their fan bases and how engaged they are and how much they care about that. Artists that you might not have heard about in the 90s that would do that. And that's a great thing because fans of all music now are feeling way more connected. It's amazing. But back then, I think the labels just wanted to find that next 10 million record and, oh, you did 2 million? Okay, I guess you're not going to do that.
What about some of the new younger acts that are carrying the torch led by these 90s jam bands that are out there now?
Yeah, have you listened to Goose?
No, I'm going to listen to them.
Goose, have you listened to Billy Strings?
Yes. Not a lot.
They're tearing it up, playing arenas. There's a band from Connecticut called Eggy, fantastic.
Right from where I am here in Connecticut.
Asbury Park, Dogs in a Pile, great. Upstate New York, Michaela Davis, fantastic. There's a lot of acts on the scene that are, I guess, carrying on that vibe of the 90s, but doing things in their own way. It's just fantastic. It's a great time for music right now.
What should the 90s jam band scene, what should the legacy be? How does it influence acts today and music festivals?
Now you have an artist like Goose who is, they're not a label. Their vinyl sells out immediately. Their fandom is crazy about their vinyl. Their live shows are stellar. They're about to play Madison Square Garden in a few days, and they've sold that out. But they've come at it with a way to sustain their career where they don't need a label, they don't need Spotify streams, but they have essentially different tiers of how you can see them live, so pay more, you get different experiences. And because of that, they're able to sustain a career and grow. And I think there's lineage from the 90s. At the end of the day, it's listening and watching bands doing what they want to do because they believe in it and the audience is connecting. That's it.
And those bands proved it can be done and you can continue on.
Sure.
Regardless of what happens in the corporate world and record labels and all that other stuff. You got a fan base, they're going to be there with you. The band Goose, also from Connecticut?
Also from Connecticut.
Wilton, Connecticut. That's very cool, man. That's awesome. Sharing the Groove, the untold story of the 90s jam band explosion and the scene that followed. It's out now. You can find it wherever books are sold. Look for it at your nearest bookstore. You can go to bookedonrock.com to find your nearest independent bookstore. Where can people find you online, Mike?
Mike-Ayers.com, and the Instagram is at the Mike Ayers. That's where I'm at.
Cool. Mike, it was great talking to you. I'm a huge fan, as you can tell, of this era. So great to have this book out. It's a must read for all the fans of the jam band scene, from the 90s scene, Dead fans, Phish fans, whatever. You got to go out and get this book.
Thanks, Eric. I really appreciate it.
That's it. It's in the books.